They called her Lady Death, and for good reason. Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't just any sniper. She was the nightmare of over 300 German soldiers during World War II, when most people were running from the front lines. She ran toward them, armed with a rifle, a steady hand, and ice in her veins. She started as a history student, but the moment war broke out, she traded books for bullets and became one of the deadliest snipers in history. The Nazis tried to take her down, even sent messages over loudspeakers begging her to switch sides. Big mistake, she answered with another confirmed kill. And when the war was done, she didn't stop there. She stood before the world as proof that women could fight just as fiercely, just as fearlessly as any man alive. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the woman who turned death into her legacy. In the summer of 1941, the steel-cold roar of war crashed into the Soviet Union, and from the smoke of that conflict emerged a figure whose calm precision would both terrify and inspire. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko. Born in Ukraine, trained as a marksman and driven by fierce determination, she volunteered for the front when few expected a woman to step into the line of fire. In the sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol, her rifle cracked like thunder and her tally mounted, earning her the nickname Lady Death. This is the story of how a history student became one of the most lethal snipers in history, and then a symbol of strength beyond the battlefield. In the summer of 1941, the world was already burning. Europe lay under the shadow of the swastika, and the Soviet Union was about to face the full fury of Operation Barbarossa. In the cities and villages across the vast expanse of the USSR, sirens screamed, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life shattered overnight. In Kiev, a 24-year-old university student stood at the crossroads of history, her books and her rifle colliding in the same heartbeat. Her name was Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko, and the war was about to turn her into something more than a soldier. It would turn her into a legend. Before the war, she was like many young women of her generation, filled with ambition and a thirst for knowledge. She studied history at Kiev University, tracing the rise and fall of empires with the careful discipline of a scholar. But beneath that scholarly calm was a fierce determination, a spark that refused to yield. As a teenager, she had joined a sharpshooting club and learned the art of precision. The recoil of the rifle, the smell of gunpowder, the perfect alignment of sights and target. These were things she mastered long before she imagined they would decide her fate. Lyudmila was born in 1916 in Bila Tserkva, a small Ukrainian town. When her family moved to Kiev, she grew restless, drawn to challenges that tested her endurance. She competed with boys at every turn, climbing higher, running faster, shooting straighter. At 14, she joined a shooting range simply to prove that she could outshoot anyone who doubted her. She earned the Voroshilov sharpshooter badge, a mark of Soviet excellence in marksmanship. It wasn't just a pastime for her. It was discipline, a kind of silent power. When war came, she was already prepared in ways few realized. The sound of marching boots replaced the hum of lectures, and the classroom where she studied ancient wars suddenly seemed distant compared to the brutal reality outside. The invasion began without mercy. German planes darkened the skies, their bombs carving fire into the earth. Villages burned, soldiers fell, and the borders of the Soviet Union were drenched in chaos. In those first desperate days, thousands rushed to volunteer, and Lyudmila was among them. At the recruiting office in Odessa, she stood in line wearing the uniform of conviction. She asked to serve as a sniper. The men behind the desk stared in disbelief. A woman, they said, belonged in the medical corps, not the front lines. She refused. They handed her a test rifle and pointed toward a field target far beyond the distance expected of an amateur. She took aim, squeezed the trigger, and hit the mark with precision that silenced every voice around her. When she handed back the weapon, she said simply, "I wish to serve where I can be most useful." She was accepted. That moment marked the beginning of her transformation. No longer the history student, no longer the curious markswoman. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was now a soldier of the Red Army, assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. Her life of quiet study had ended. Ahead lay the trenches, the fear, the endless battle between life and death, and the sound of her rifle, the single sharp punctuation of fate. The war had come for everyone, but for Lyudmila, it would become personal. She wasn't fighting only for the Soviet Union. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been told she could not stand on equal ground. In that first decision to defy expectation, she began to carve her place in history. She did not yet know that her name would one day echo across continents as Lady Death, but she already carried the composure and resolve of someone who would never surrender. The world around her was descending into horror, and she would meet it with unflinching aim. The invasion of the Soviet Union came like a storm, with no warning, tearing through the western borders and swallowing entire cities in days. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had been studying for her exams at Kiev University when the news spread. Students poured into the streets, their voices filled with both fear and anger. She didn't hesitate. The next morning, she joined the line of volunteers outside the recruiting station in Odessa, a city that would soon become her first battlefield. The officer behind the desk barely looked up when she stepped forward. "Medical service?" he asked. She shook her head. "Sniper?" she said firmly. He frowned. "Women don't serve as snipers." She said nothing, only stared back until he handed her a rifle to test her claim. At the practice field, she lay down, adjusted the scope, and fired. The target fell. Then another, then another. When she rose, there was nothing left to question. The officer signed her papers without another word. She was issued a Mosin Nagant rifle, heavy, cold, and worn from years of use. The weapon was her companion through every moment of the war that followed. At first, she dug trenches, carried supplies, and watched the chaos unfold. There were too few rifles, too many dead. One day, a fallen comrade's rifle was placed in her hands, and from that moment, she took her first position as a sniper of the Red Army. The first time she pulled the trigger in battle, her heart hammered in her chest. She saw the enemy through the scope, a German scout crossing an open field. She exhaled slowly, pressed the trigger, and watched the man fall. It was over in an instant, yet it marked the beginning of a relentless path. She did not celebrate, did not speak. She simply moved to the next position, ready for the next shot. Lyudmila's precision and composure drew the attention of her superiors. She never flinched under fire, never hesitated. Within days, she became one of the most reliable snipers in her unit. The men who had doubted her learned quickly that she needed no protection. She was calm, efficient, and deadly. Every shot she fired carried the weight of both duty and defiance. As the battles raged across the front, she shed the last traces of civilian life. The young scholar who had once studied history was now living it, shaping it bullet by bullet. The war would take her to Odessa's walls, to Sevastopol's trenches, and through fire that no human should have survived. But in those first days, when smoke filled the air and the enemy pressed closer, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had already proven one truth. The world could no longer tell her where she belonged. Odessa burned beneath the weight of artillery and smoke. The sea was gray with ash, and the sound of gunfire echoed day and night across the crumbling city. It was the summer of 1941, and the Soviet defense of Odessa had begun. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, this was no longer training or preparation. This was war in its rawest form, and she had stepped directly into its center. The 25th Rifle Division had been deployed to defend the southern approaches of the city. The heat was suffocating, the ground churned by shells and the air thick with dust and the smell of cordite. She moved among veterans now, men hardened by battle, their faces etched with exhaustion. At first, some still doubted her place among them. But when the first attack came, and her rifle cracked with deadly precision, no one questioned her again. Her first confirmed kills came early in the siege. Through the scope of her Mosin Nagant, she saw two Romanian collaborators approaching the Soviet line. They moved carelessly, confident in their numbers. Lyudmila steadied her breath, adjusted her aim, and fired twice. Both fell before they could even shout a warning. She watched them drop and felt the strange silence that follows the act. A silence not of triumph, but of necessity. In that moment, she became a soldier not just in uniform, but in spirit. The siege ground on day after day, each sunrise another test of endurance. Snipers like Lyudmila became both hunters and prey. The enemy learned to fear the unseen shot, the whisper of death that came without warning. She shifted positions constantly, blending into ruins, trees, and rubble. She learned to move like a shadow, to disappear before a counter-sniper could find her. Hours passed without motion. her cheek pressed to the rifle stock, eyes never leaving the glass of her scope. She killed with precision, not rage. Every shot was measured, deliberate, cold. At night, she cleaned her rifle with care, checked her ammunition, and slept with her weapon beside her like a comrade. By the end of the first month in Odessa, her confirmed tally had risen to dozens. By the third month, it reached over 100. The men around her began to whisper her name with both awe and superstition. She was not just a comrade. They said she was fate itself, striking from the unseen. Rumors spread through the ranks of both armies. The Germans and Romanians began to call her Lady Death, though she never sought the name. To her, it was simply the work of survival. But each time she pulled the trigger, the legend grew. Her presence was both a comfort and a warning, a reminder that one steady hand could change the course of a battle. She was promoted to senior sergeant as her tally climbed past 187 confirmed kills. Commanders began sending her to the most dangerous sectors, where enemy snipers were picking off Soviet officers. She learned to recognize their patterns, their habits, their arrogance. Sometimes the duels would last for hours, each sniper searching for the other's reflection in a scope or the glint of sunlight on metal. She outlasted them all. The men she fought beside began to look to her not only as a sharpshooter, but as a symbol of endurance. She refused to show fear, even when artillery rained down so heavily that the sky seemed to collapse. When comrades fell beside her, she would close their eyes, take their ammunition, and move on. War allowed no time for grief. During lulls in the fighting, she would write brief notes to her family, careful not to reveal her position or duties. Her handwriting remained neat, precise, disciplined, just like her shooting. She never spoke of her kills in those letters. Instead, she wrote of weather, of rations, of comrades, of hope. In her quiet words, she still clung to the scholar within her, the woman who once studied history. Now she was writing it with every pull of the trigger. The siege dragged into autumn and Odessa grew colder. The once beautiful port city was now a labyrinth of rubble and graves. But for Lyudmila, it was where she had forged her skill and her resolve. By the time the Soviet command ordered a withdrawal in October 1941, she had become one of the most feared and respected snipers on the Eastern Front. The retreat was bitter. No one wanted to abandon the city they had bled for, but orders were orders. As she boarded the transport bound for Sevastopol, she looked back at the burning skyline. The smoke curled upward like ghosts of the fallen. In the distance, she could still hear the dull rhythm of artillery. Odessa had taken much from her: friends, innocence, peace. But it had also given her a name, a purpose, and a place in the unyielding rhythm of war. She carried her rifle close, her eyes calm and steady. The sea wind brushed her face as the ship pulled away from the harbor. Behind her lay months of fire and loss. Ahead, even greater battles awaited. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had entered Odessa as a young soldier eager to prove herself. She left it as Lady Death, the sniper whose legend would only continue to grow. The sea voyage from Odessa to Sevastopol was silent, except for the rumble of engines and the distant thunder of war. The soldiers aboard carried exhaustion in their faces, but Lyudmila Pavlichenko carried something heavier, a quiet certainty that her fight was far from over. The fall of Odessa had been bitter, yet the spirit of its defenders burned within her. As the ship approached the port of Sevastopol, the horizon shimmered with the dull glow of bombardment. She had been called to one of the most brutal battles of the war, and she would meet it without hesitation. Sevastopol was already under siege when she arrived in October 1941. The city stood as the final stronghold of Soviet resistance on the Crimean Peninsula. Its cliffs overlooked the Black Sea, its defenses carved into the rock, and its soldiers lived beneath the constant shriek of shells. Lyudmila stepped into a world of fire and stone, where the front lines shifted daily and survival depended on both instinct and endurance. She joined the 25th Rifle Division once again, reunited with comrades who had survived Odessa, though many faces were missing. The air was heavy with smoke and memory. She took up position on the northern sector, where the terrain offered both danger and advantage. The hills and trenches gave cover, but they also drew enemy snipers. Every day began with reconnaissance, crawling through mud and shattered earth to find the best vantage points. She worked in pairs, one spotter, one shooter, but often she preferred to operate alone. Silence was her ally, and solitude gave her clarity. Through her scope, she watched the enemy advance, patient and methodical. She studied patterns of movement, the rhythm of patrols, the telltale shimmer of glass that betrayed a sniper's scope. By winter, her count had passed 200 confirmed kills. The army began to whisper her name not just as Lady Death, but as a symbol of the city's defiance. The Germans spread rumors of a female sniper who never missed, and her existence unsettled them. Psychological warfare worked both ways. Each time an officer fell to a single, distant shot, fear rippled through the ranks. They posted bounties on her head, sent counter-snipers to hunt her, and even broadcast taunts through loudspeakers promising her safety if she surrendered. She ignored them all. The war was not a place for words. Among her most dangerous assignments were sniper duels. The enemy sent their best to find her, men trained with equal patience and skill. The duels could last for hours, sometimes days. She learned to track subtle details, the shadow that moved twice, the flicker of reflection at dawn, the faint outline of a helmet beneath brush. When she fired only once. Many of those duels ended with silence on the other end of the line. By spring of 1942, she had eliminated 36 enemy snipers, each one a duel between death and survival. Her reputation reached beyond the trenches. Soviet command recognized her as both a weapon and a symbol. Propaganda posters spread her image, her face calm and resolute beneath the steel helmet. To soldiers at the front, she was proof that even in ruin, the Soviet spirit endured. To the enemy, she was myth and terror combined. Yet within herself, she felt no pride in the number of lives taken. Each confirmed kill was a necessity, not a triumph. She wrote in her journal when she could, short, simple lines about exhaustion, comradeship, and the endless echo of gunfire. Her handwriting trembled less from fear than from fatigue. The siege of Sevastopol was relentless. The city was bombarded from land, sea, and air. She spent days without rest, moving through cratered ground to new positions. Once, a mortar shell landed close enough to throw her from her post, the blast deafening her for hours. She returned to her rifle as soon as she could hear again. Her commanders urged her to rest, but she refused. "If I stop," she told one of them, "the enemy will not." Her face was gaunt, her uniform worn thin, but her eyes remained sharp, steady, and unbroken. As months passed, the line of defense shrank. Supplies dwindled, and casualties mounted. Yet the defenders of Sevastopol held on. Lyudmila fought through rain, frost, and hunger. Every day, another test of endurance. Her rifle had become an extension of her own body, and each shot was a deliberate strike against the encroaching dark. Her kills rose to 257 by May 1942, and still she pressed forward. The city around her was crumbling, yet she seemed carved from the same stone that refused to yield. One day, during a rare moment of rest, she received a letter from her commander commending her service. Attached was the formal citation of her confirmed record, over 300 enemy soldiers neutralized. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her coat. Numbers meant little to her now. What mattered were the faces of the comrades who would never read their own commendations. By early June, Sevastopol was a ruin, yet still defended with desperate resolve. The bombardment intensified, the sky itself aflame. It was during one of these barrages that Lyudmila's war would change forever. A mortar exploded near her observation point, and shrapnel tore into her flesh. Blood filled her mouth, and the world spun into darkness. She was dragged away by her unit, half conscious, the rifle she refused to let go still clutched in her hands. When she awoke, she was aboard a submarine, leaving the city under siege. Her body was broken, but her spirit remained. As Sevastopol burned behind her, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's chapter on the front lines came to an end. She had entered the war as a student, survived Odessa as a soldier, and left Sevastopol as a legend. Her rifle had fallen silent, but the echo of its fire would carry across nations through time and into history itself. The submarine hummed beneath the waves, carrying with it the wounded and the weary from the ruins of Sevastopol. The corridors smelled of oil and blood, a mix of machinery and mortality. Lyudmila Pavlichenko lay on a narrow bunk, her body wrapped in bandages, her left side seared by the jagged wound left by shrapnel. Her rifle was beside her, scarred and worn, as if it too had survived the battle. Outside, the world she had fought for drifted away beneath the smoke of destruction. Sevastopol had fallen into silence, but her war had not yet ended. The shrapnel had torn through her flesh, cutting deep near her shoulder and ribs. Every breath brought pain, yet she refused to show weakness. When the medics asked her to rest, she only nodded and clenched her jaw. Her thoughts returned to the comrades she had left behind, the ones who had carried her through the mud, shouting her name above the explosions. Many of them would never leave that city. The sea separated her from their graves now, and the guilt pressed heavier than any bandage. In the hospital at Novorossiysk, she woke to the rhythmic pulse of machines and the murmurs of other wounded soldiers. Her body ached, but the real wound lay deeper. The front had been her purpose, her identity. For months, she had lived with the singular clarity of the rifle's scope, each breath aligned with the heartbeat of battle. Now, confined to a white bed under sterile light, she felt lost in the quiet. The doctor spoke of recovery, of future duties, of medals. None of it mattered to her then. What mattered was the rifle, the fight. The comrades still out there under the reign of artillery command visited her days later. She sat upright, uniform rebuttoned despite the pain, and asked when she could return to the front. The officer looked at her with both admiration and finality. "You've done more than your share, Comrade Pavlichenko," he said softly. "You are too valuable to risk again." The word struck her harder than the shrapnel. To be called valuable was to be confined, to be kept away from the very thing that had defined her. Yet orders were orders, and she obeyed. The front would continue without her trigger finger among its defenders. NHER convalescence turned into reflection. Letters from soldiers reached her bed, men she had trained, comrades who wrote simply to say they were alive because of something she had taught them. They thanked her for her courage, for her precision, for her calm. She read each note slowly, tracing the handwriting of soldiers who would return to a world she could only glimpse from memory. She began to understand that her purpose might not end with the battlefield. The war needed more than bullets. It needed voices, faces, symbols. When she could finally walk again, she was assigned to train new recruits, snipers who would take her lessons and carry them back into the fire. She stood before rows of young soldiers, many barely out of adolescence, their eyes bright with both fear and pride. She taught them how to breathe before a shot, how to disappear into the earth, how to wait hours for a single moment of purpose. She spoke not of glory, but of endurance. Every shot, she told them, must have meaning. You cannot fight if you cannot think. Yet even as she trained them, a part of her longed for the sound of the front, the thud of mortars, the rustle of wind through ruined fields, the pulse of life and death at the edge of a rifle sight. But she no longer belonged there. The scar across her side throbbed with each movement, a reminder of the body's limits and the cost of survival. Her name had already become legend, and legends, she realized, were often trapped by their own stories. One evening she was summoned again, this time not by a commander of war, but by an official from Moscow. The Soviet government had chosen her for a new mission, one unlike any she had faced before. She was to represent the Soviet Union abroad, to speak to the Allies, to show the face of courage and endurance to the world. It was both an honor and a burden. She looked at the official's polished boots, at the pristine papers on the table, and wondered how speeches could ever replace the simplicity of a rifle's aim. Still, she accepted the order. A soldier obeys, no matter the field of battle. As she prepared to leave the hospital, she paused before her reflection in a small mirror. The scar on her face had healed, pale against her skin, a reminder of every choice that had brought her here. The young student of Kiev was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and carried the weight of hundreds of lives ended and saved. Her rifle would remain behind, silent and clean. Ahead lay another kind of war, a battle of words, appearances, and diplomacy. An NTHE ship that would carry her west waited at the harbor. The air smelled of salt and smoke, familiar and foreign all at once. She stood at the edge of the dock, her uniform crisp, her medals gleaming faintly in the gray light. The sea stretched out before her, as it had when she left Odessa, as it had when she left Sevastopol. But this time, She was not sailing toward war. She was sailing toward the world, carrying the story of those who could no longer speak. Lyudmila Pavlichenko turned her gaze toward the horizon and squared her shoulders. The battlefields of the Eastern Front lay behind her, but the fight for memory, truth, and recognition had only begun. She was no longer Lady Death with a rifle in her hands. She was now the living proof of what courage costs, and what it must continue to defend. The ship that carried Lyudmila Pavlichenko across the Atlantic moved through gray, restless waters, its engines humming beneath the waves, like the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She stood on deck in her Soviet uniform, her medals polished but understated, her posture straight despite the weight of memory pressing on her shoulders. Behind her lay the blood-soaked fields of Sevastopol. Ahead awaited a world untouched by the war's true brutality, a world she had been sent to awaken. It was 1942, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, hero of the Soviet Union, was no longer fighting with a rifle. Her weapon now was her voice. The journey to the United States was long, filled with silence broken only by the crash of waves and the distant echo of thoughts she could not silence. She wondered what kind of world she would find across the ocean, what people who had not lived under bombardment could ever understand of what she had seen. She carried with her not only her medals and scars, but the memory of hundreds of comrades buried in the soil of Ukraine and Crimea. Their faces followed her in dreams, and she promised herself that every word she would speak abroad would be for them. When she arrived in Washington, the heat was heavy, the air thick with the scent of a world still at peace. Cameras flashed as she stepped off the plane, reporters shouting questions, dazzled by the idea of a female sniper. To them, she was both curiosity and symbol, a woman who had killed more than 300 enemy soldiers, yet stood poised and silent like a scholar. They asked about her lipstick, her hairstyle, her uniform. Few asked about Sevastopol, few wanted to hear about death. When one reporter asked if she wore makeup on the front lines, she replied evenly, "There is no rule against it, but there is little time for it between battles." Her first meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt was quiet, filled with mutual respect. The First Lady greeted her with genuine warmth, asking not about war, but about endurance, about what it meant to carry such a burden. Lyudmila admired her composure, the strength hidden beneath grace. Together they traveled across the United States, from Washington to Chicago, Detroit, and New York. In each city she stood before crowds, the medals of the Soviet Union glinting in the sunlight, and spoke of the war that still raged across her homeland. Her speeches were direct, unwavering, and heavy with truth. At one gathering in Chicago, she faced a hall packed with reporters and curious citizens. The questions began politely, then turned sharp, dismissive, laced with disbelief. A woman, they seemed to think, could not truly be a soldier. They asked how she could bear to kill. They asked if she cried after shooting. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a calm that silenced the room, she answered, "I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The hall erupted in applause. The weight of her words pierced deeper than any bullet. The American public began to see her not merely as a soldier, but as a mirror of their own hesitation. She was the embodiment of a war they had not yet fully joined, a living reminder that neutrality could not last forever. Newspapers began to print her story. Some romanticized her as the girl sniper, while others portrayed her as a symbol of Soviet endurance. She ignored both extremes. Her mission was not to charm, it was to awaken. She met President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House, where they spoke briefly about the Eastern Front, about the siege of Sevastopol, and about the strength of the Soviet resistance. The president listened attentively, his expression solemn. When the meeting ended, he shook her hand firmly and said, "You have done more for your country than most ever could." She nodded, knowing that her purpose there was not praise but persuasion. Lyudmila's tour continued into Canada and Great Britain, where she met soldiers, factory workers, and students. In every speech, she called for unity, for the opening of a second front in Europe. She spoke not as a diplomat, but as a survivor. Her words carried the weight of burned villages, fallen comrades, and unmarked graves. She spoke of frost-bitten soldiers sharing a single crust of bread, of women carrying rifles alongside men, of a people fighting not for glory but for existence. Her voice was measured, her gaze unwavering. The Western press continued to circle around her with fascination. They printed photographs of her smiling beside Eleanor Roosevelt, of her standing at memorials, of her quiet dignity amidst the noise of cameras. But beneath the image lay exhaustion. At night, when the applause faded, she would return to her hotel room and sit in silence, the hum of the city outside sounding too alive, too distant from the ruins of home. Sometimes she would polish the medals on her uniform and stare at their reflection until the memories blurred. For all the admiration she received, she never let it soften her purpose. She refused offers of glamour, interviews that sought to make her a spectacle. "I did not come here to entertain," she told one journalist. "I came here to remind." She carried herself with the same discipline she had in battle, her words measured, her emotions controlled. Her speeches were a continuation of her service, each one a shot fired across oceans, each one aimed at the conscience of nations. When her tour ended, she stood once more on the deck of a ship bound for home. The Atlantic stretched wide before her, but the sense of distance was gone. She had spoken for her country, for her comrades, for every soldier still fighting. She had traded her rifle for the power of truth, and though her voice carried no echo of gunfire, it struck with equal precision. As the coastline of Europe appeared faintly on the horizon, she thought of the words she had spoken again and again. The world must not wait for others to die before it acts. The wind caught her hair as she watched the gray waves break against the hull. The war was far from over, but she had done her part once more, not through blood, but through conviction. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the sniper who had survived the front, had become the messenger of its ghosts. The sound of her rifle was gone, but her words would continue to ring in the hearts of those who had heard them. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned to the Soviet Union in 1943, the land she had left behind no longer resembled the home she once knew. Cities were scarred by bombings, villages burned to the ground, and the faces of the people she passed bore the same weary determination she carried within. She stepped off the train onto the platform in Moscow, her uniform crisp, her medals glinting faintly in the pale light. The cheers that greeted her were full of pride, yet behind every smile she saw the same unspoken question: how much more could they endure? She was sent first to Sevastopol, or rather, to what was left of it. The city that had once been a fortress of defiance now lay in ruins. Rubble stretched where buildings once stood. The sea breeze carried the scent of smoke and salt, mingling with the silence of absence. She walked through the shattered streets, recognizing landmarks only by memory, recalling the friends who had fought and fallen beside her. She paused at the edge of a crumbled wall and ran her gloved hand over the cracked stone. Beneath it, somewhere unseen, lay soldiers whose names were never recorded. She whispered their names, one by one, until her voice broke. The command recognized her not only as a hero, but as a symbol. They appointed her as an instructor at the Central School for Sniper Training, where she would shape a new generation of marksmen and women. The young recruits watched her with reverence, whispering stories of Lady Death, the sniper who had never missed her mark. Yet Lyudmila discouraged myth. She walked among them not as a legend, but as a teacher. She demonstrated the slow patience of breathing, the art of blending into the earth, the steady pull of the trigger that required no hatred, only clarity. The rifle, she told them, is not for vengeance, it is for protection, for the lives that cannot defend themselves. Her students listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine the battles she described. To them, the war was still distant, a test they were yet to face. To her, it was a memory etched so deeply that even silence could not erase it. She corrected their aim, adjusted their stances, and taught them to endure hunger, cold, and fear. She moved with quiet authority, her every motion deliberate. Some evenings, she stayed long after training ended, sitting alone in the empty shooting range, her hands resting on her knees, her thoughts adrift between the living and the dead. Though she no longer fought on the front lines, her mind remained bound to them. Each report from the south, each mention of a counteroffensive, stirred both pride and pain. She wanted to return, to hold her rifle once more and take her place among her comrades. But her superiors refused. Her value now was symbolic, they said. Her life carried meaning beyond the battlefield. She accepted the decision outwardly, though in private she struggled against the weight of inactivity. Teaching others to fight was an honor, yet watching others take up the burden she once carried felt like surrender. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, Lyudmila began to see her teachings take root. Reports came from the front of her former students achieving remarkable success, protecting their units with precision and courage. Each letter she received filled her with quiet satisfaction. Her legacy, she realized, was not in the number of enemies she had killed, but in the lives her students now protected. She had become not just a sniper, but a builder of endurance, a preserver of skill. One evening in late 1944, she visited the hospital, where wounded soldiers from Sevastopol were being treated. The corridors were lined with cots, the air filled with the smell of medicine and metal. A young soldier recognized her and saluted weakly from his bed, his arm in a sling. "Comrade Pavlichenko," he said, his voice hoarse. "They say you trained my brother. He said you taught him how to breathe before firing. He said that's what saved him." She smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then he was a good student," she replied softly. "Tell him I am proud." The news of the Red Army's advance toward Berlin reached her in the spring of 1945. Victory was approaching, though it came at a cost beyond measure. When the German surrender was announced, Moscow erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, embracing strangers, singing songs of triumph. Lyudmila stood at her window, watching the joy she could not quite feel. She thought of the faces that were missing, the laughter that would never return. The war was over, but peace did not erase the scars it left behind. In the days that followed, she was summoned once more to Moscow for official ceremonies. Medals were pinned to her chest, photographs were taken, and speeches were given in her honor. Yet she felt no hunger for recognition. The applause was distant, hollow compared to the silence of the fields she had once watched through her rifle scope. When asked to speak, she said only, "We have won because we refused to break. May we remember what that cost." That night, she returned to her quarters and carefully placed her rifle on the table before her. The wood was worn, the metal scarred, yet it remained clean and well kept. She traced the edges of the weapon with her fingertips, recalling every moment it had saved her life, every life it had taken. Then she set it aside, as if laying to rest a part of herself. The war had demanded everything, and though she had survived, she knew she had left much of her soul behind. As dawn broke over Moscow, Lyudmila stepped outside, her uniform pressed, her medals shining faintly in the morning light. The air was cool, the city quiet in the first breath of peace. She walked through the streets slowly, taking in the sight of people rebuilding, of children laughing, of a world that had begun to heal. She felt no triumph, only a deep, steady calm. She had done her duty. She had endured the unimaginable and carried the weight of it without faltering. And now, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe freely. The years following the war unfolded quietly for Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The medals that once glittered beneath foreign lights now rested in a small box, their brilliance dulled by time. She had returned to civilian life in a country rebuilding from ashes, its people determined to rise from ruin. Moscow thrummed with the sound of renewal, construction, laughter, the echo of music in open windows. But for Lyudmila, peace carried its own silence. She had exchanged the battlefield for lecture halls, rifles for words, and the noise of war for the stillness of memory. She worked for the Soviet Navy's headquarters and later pursued studies in history at Kiev University, immersing herself in books and lectures as if each page could distance her from the ghosts that still lingered. Her colleagues treated her with reverence, though few dared to ask about the past. They saw the ribbons, the medals, the quiet authority that never faded, and understood that behind her calm eyes lay a story too heavy to disturb. She carried herself with the same discipline she had on the front lines, measured steps, deliberate words, always in control. But when the halls emptied, she sometimes lingered, tracing her fingers over the old photographs pinned to her desk. Comrades smiling, rifles slung across their shoulders, the Sea of Sevastopol behind them. Many of those faces had long since faded from the earth, but they remained vivid in her memory. In 1946, she was invited to speak at a veterans gathering in Moscow. The hall was packed with men and women in worn uniforms, their medals clinking softly as they took their seats. Lyudmila stepped to the podium, her posture straight, her voice steady. She spoke not of glory or victory, but of endurance, of the price paid in silence by those who fought. "We do not live to be remembered as heroes," she said. "We live to remember those who could not return." Her words were simple, yet they filled the hall with quiet reverence. When she finished, the applause rose not in thunder, but in solemn unity, an acknowledgement of shared pain and quiet pride. Her fame, once blazing across continents, began to fade into history. The newspapers no longer printed her name, and the world, consumed by new conflicts and shifting politics, moved on. Yet within the Soviet Union, her legacy endured in whispers and textbooks, her story told to young cadets who learned to hold their breath before firing. She remained modest, refusing to glorify her achievements. When asked how she managed to survive, she replied, "Because others did not." It was not humility, but truth. In the 1950s, she began to experience recurring bouts of illness, the old wounds of war manifesting in new ways. The concussions from artillery blasts, the cold endured in trenches, the strain of battle, all had left invisible scars. Her health declined steadily, yet she never complained. She continued to teach, to write, to visit veterans. Hospitals where she spoke quietly, with those still bearing the cost of victory. Soldiers would sit beside her, some with missing limbs, others haunted by unseen wounds. And she would tell them, "You have already given enough. Live now for those who cannot." She maintained her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt through letters that crossed oceans, the correspondence of two women who had seen humanity at its best and worst. In those letters, Lyudmila spoke of her students, of the progress of post-war reconstruction, and of her hope that nations might one day learn to resolve conflict without blood. The First Lady replied with warmth and admiration, calling her a woman of steel and grace. Their exchange was brief but meaningful, a reminder that respect could exist even between worlds once divided by ideology. By the 1960s, Lyudmila lived a quiet life in Moscow, surrounded by books, medals, and silence. The war had ended 2 decades before, yet for her, it was never truly gone. Sometimes, when the city was still and the moonlight fell through her window, she would dream of the front, the crack of rifles, the scent of pine and gunpowder, the voice of her spotter calling distances. In those dreams, she was young again, lying in the tall grass, her breath slow and even, her fingers steady on the trigger. Then she would wake, her heart racing, and stare at the ceiling until dawn erased the ghosts. In her final years, she appeared occasionally at public commemorations, standing among rows of decorated veterans. Crowds would whisper her name, recognizing the woman who had once been called Lady Death. Children would approach her shyly, offering flowers. She would smile softly, thanking them, her eyes distant. When asked what she thought of that title, she would answer, "It was never about death. It was about life, defending it, preserving it." On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko passed away in her Moscow apartment at the age of 58. News of her death spread quietly, the headlines brief but respectful. Old comrades wept, and young soldiers saluted her photograph. She was buried with full military honors at Novodevichy Cemetery, among poets, generals, and heroes. As the honor guard fired their rifles into the sky, the sound echoed through the autumn air like a final salute to the woman who had once stood alone against an army. Even after her passing, her story endured, not as a tale of blood and battle, but as a testament to courage, discipline, and resilience. Historians wrote of her precision, her skill, her record unmatched by any female sniper in history. But those who knew her remembered something deeper, her humanity. She had not glorified war. She had endured it. She had not sought fame. She had borne responsibility. And though the title Lady Death would follow her forever, those who understood her legacy knew that beneath that name was a heart that had fought not for destruction, but for the fragile promise of peace. In the quiet that followed her funeral, the wind rustled through the leaves above her grave. Somewhere, far beyond the city, The Black Sea rolled against the cliffs of Sevastopol, whispering to the stones that once bore her footsteps. The world she had fought for continued, scarred, but alive. And though she was gone, the memory of her steadiness, of the young woman who lay hidden in the grass, calm and unshaken as history unfolded around her, remained eternal. Time has softened the echoes of war, but the name Lyudmila Pavlichenko still carries the weight of history. Her story is not merely of numbers or medals, but of unshakable resolve in the face of horror. She began as a student who loved books and learning, and became a soldier who defended her homeland with unyielding precision. Through loss, pain, and duty, she stood unbroken, her strength drawn not from hatred but from conviction. When the world doubted her, she answered with quiet courage. When peace returned, she laid down her weapon and chose remembrance over vengeance. Her legacy endures beyond the battlefield, in the generations she inspired and the truths she embodied. She proved that courage knows no gender, that dignity can exist even amid destruction, and that the cost of freedom is always measured in sacrifice. Her voice, once calling for unity across oceans, still resonates as a warning and a promise that peace must be guarded as fiercely as life itself. In the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, history does not whisper of death, but of endurance. The Lady Death, who once silenced her enemies, became the woman who taught the world what it means to live with purpose.